We are back, and we are joined now by Michael Brenes, co-director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and lecturer in history at Yale University, whose recent piece in the Boston Review is entitled "The Harris Doctrine." And then you write below, would Kamala Harris's foreign policy depart from Biden's? Clues from the work of her national security advisor, Philip Gordon. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm a pleasure to be here.
So before we get more specifically to Harris and Philip Gordon, who you profile in your piece, the national security advisor for the VP, Jake Sullivan is the current national security advisor, and you wrote something in at the start of your piece that was very striking, that he's, quote, transformed the role unlike any figure since Henry Kissinger. That is strong language, but based on, of course, his deep involvement and the scale of the horrors in Gaza. Obviously, I'm interested in how you came to that conclusion, because on its face it seems very accurate and chilling.
Yeah, what I meant by that was that when Henry Kissinger became national security advisor under Nixon, he essentially consolidated control of foreign policy in the White House. So, ostracizing the Department of State and the Department of Defense, and making sure that foreign policy was really between two men, Nixon and Kissinger. And Nixon essentially deferred to Kissinger on many things related to foreign policy. I think a similar but not quite identical phenomenon is happening now, where if you look at the reporting on what's happening in foreign policy, Sullivan has essentially taken charge of Ukraine policy. He's been widely reported to be working on China policy and back-channel diplomacy with China, but he's also unique to history. He's also coordinating economic policy. Sullivan was the one who came out and pronounced the end of the free trade neoliberal consensus and at Brookings institution, and that's quite rare, I think, for someone in his position. It wasn't a speech by the Council of Economic Advisors. It wasn't Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, making that speech. It was Sullivan, and I think that's really quite interesting in historical terms. And I think that's meant that foreign policy and the National Security Council in general has become more undemocratic in many ways, and more unresponsive to other institutions outside of the NSC, and therefore, of course, less responsive to public pressures in many ways, because the National Security Advisor is not, he doesn't have to, or she doesn't have to be approved by Congress. So I think that's also something to consider. And that's what I meant. It was not that Sullivan is a Kissinger-like figure in the sense of what his policies are, but that he has consolidated power in the NSC in ways that I think are quite unique in American history.
And does not portend well for future usage of that power, right? I mean, even if it's this kind of odd integration with economic policy. I mean, Biden's domestic policy as it relates to infrastructure was linked to competition with China. So you could probably find a lot of Jake Sullivan's influence within that kind of policy set. Jake Sullivan's background, my understanding is that Sullivan worked when he did in the Obama administration. He worked under Clinton and then Vice President Biden. What would you say his ideology is that you can glean from his past work, or say even who he worked for within the Obama administration?
I think Sullivan has many sides. I think that's he's not. Again, he's not a Kissinger-like figure in some ways. I think he is, in many ways, sort of a traditional liberal internationalist. He believes the United States, is a force for good. That's nothing unique in Washington, D.C., that American power is a force for good. I also, though, think he has a sense of history and a sense of what is possible with American power in historical context. But I think he again, to my earlier point, I think he's in a position where he is essentially trying to do everything. And that's not a good thing for, I think, overall, the distribution of power in the government, and also, again, sort of the nature of democratic foreign policy making. I think, too, Sullivan is in a position where he reportedly works many hours. He's able to do, he's incredibly brilliant. He's incredibly capable of doing the things that he's doing. It's just that I think that he's part of a project of foreign policy that is trying to do too much, as Stephen Wertheim and others have said, without limits. And I think that's bad. And I don't think Sullivan would be in a position where he would say, I'm not doing those things. I think he'd be essentially saying, I'm trying to be the conduit for the president. But at the same time, I think, it's the responsibility of someone like someone in his position to say, there's ultimately things the United States can't do and shouldn't be doing. And I think that's where the interest or the contrast with Gordon, I think, and Philip Gordon, Kamala Harris, national security advisor, I think would be interesting.
I'm very excited to get into that contrast, but just one more question on Sullivan here. Is he across the pursuing of this Abraham Accord strategy that the Biden administration has been repeatedly tripling down on, which was a Trump era normalization deal between the Saudis and Israel, and there are potentially defense guarantees that are being promised to Saudi Arabia, which in my view is disastrous. But I'm wondering how people that Sullivan was in the Obama administration, right? Like, how do you get from that point of that administration pursuing the Iran deal to a level where now we're continuing Trump foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East?
I think a lot of this is a reflection of Biden himself and how Biden thinks that he can control Middle East, Middle East policy, Middle East affairs. I think Biden is in a position where he feels he knows best, that his seniority, his expertise has served him well. And he's also, I think, surrounded by people like Brett McGurk, who are in many ways also the architect of a new Middle East policy that is reflective of the way in which U.S.-Israeli relations has changed over the Trump years and into Biden, and since the Netanyahu government came to the fore. And I think that is really what's happening. I don't know what Sullivan is doing behind the scenes, if he's privately saying this is not a good policy, this is not in our best interests. Sullivan reportedly, there was a profile of him in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, or maybe last year. And I think he sees himself as serving the president's bidding and serving what the president wants to do. And I think the current policy, the Saudi-Israel normalization deal, the unwillingness to kind of revive the Iran nuclear deal, I think is a reflection of Biden, and I think where Biden stands in terms of his foreign policy, less so Sullivan as an architect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been emphasizing here on the show Biden's long romanticized history with Zionism and his hawkishness on Israel that dates back to the beginning of his career, even, or close to it, in the 70s. I mean, there were some daylight at the beginning, but he's just tripled, quadrupled down throughout the decades, right? I mean, that story that came out late yesterday about the pier, where he was reportedly advised that the aid pier outside of in the ocean outside of the Gaza Strip would likely fall apart because of weather conditions and the sea. And Biden didn't listen to his advisors and did it anyway. And it occurs to me that I saw the writer, I'm forgetting their name, but Emissary of the Night on Twitter made this point. We're going to see probably more stories that trickle out about Biden's heavy hand, potentially in saying, this State Department review of the Leahy law, it actually did find that Israel's in compliance with humanitarian law, or for something like that. Like, as he exits power, is it your assessment that his involvement in Gaza and Israel policy it may become clear that he's been heavily involved as the president in making some of these really disastrous decisions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we're going to find out that Biden was the one who, where the policy was originating from. And I think that, again, I think to my other point, I think what Sullivan and others are doing is following what the president wants. And the president's statements, I think, reflect the policy. It's obviously it's not easy to tease apart the rhetoric from the reality in terms of what's actually happening. But in terms of statements on Palestinian suffering, in terms of statements on what's happening in Gaza, in terms of increasing famine, reports of polio coming out of Gaza, those types of the everyday suffering that the Palestinians are going through. There hasn't been a shift in policy as the war has evolved in the ways that it has, and I think that's not necessarily a reflection of Sullivan. That's a reflection of Biden and where Biden wants to go with U.S.-Israeli relations and what he thinks is, in his view, the need to defer to Israeli security concerns, which I would argue are not necessarily interests of the United States at the moment in terms of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and then today or yesterday in the West Bank.
Right. Absolutely. So I wanted to flesh that out just to give people a picture of the Biden administration and how his approach has, and again, we will know more. Eventually there will be books and information that comes out about this, but just assessing it with the information that we have. So now I guess let's turn to Philip Gordon, Kamala Harris's national security advisor, who comes out of the second term Obama folks, right? Like he was under John Kerry with Ben Rhodes, is my understanding.
Yes.
Do you see a difference in ideology with the folks that were under the Hillary Clinton Secretary of State first term period for Obama and the guys that John Kerry brought in, like Philip Gordon and Ben Rhodes, who were the architects of the Iran deal, which, I was a huge fan of and remain and want us to re-enter.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there was a clear shift from, the departure of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, in the second term. And there was also, I think, just a shift in America's policy towards the Middle East and the overall shift in the war on terror by the second Obama term. And Gordon comes in as the sort of Middle East coordinator in 2013. And at that point, we're dealing with tensions in Syria. And Gordon is the one initially to say, let's start arming the opposition to Bashar al-Assad. Let's start sending weapons in. And quickly kind of changes his mind and pivots and says, I don't think that's actually going to achieve the ends that we want to achieve. And sure enough, he ends up being right. And that experience informs, I think, or helps us understand him in larger terms. I think what Gordon is, he's a unique person in Washington in the sense that he's willing to make mistakes and willing and own up to those mistakes. And I think there's a sense in Washington that to apologize for American power is not good for personal as well as political reasons. And I think what he also is a position as he is a person is unique from others is that he is coming out and sort of critiquing his own administration and saying we should never have done that. There's an entire chapter on Syria in his book, Losing the Long Game, where he says if we didn't try to arm the opposition to Assad and we didn't waste 5 years of our time, that would have been a much better policy, in keeping Assad essentially in power. This is what happened through their policy, then it would have been overall better. But without getting into the weeds too much, I think those are two big differences between someone like Gordon and many others in Washington, that he sees that America can't always do good with its power, even though he is, I think, willing to use American military power. And then he's also willing to sort of change his mind and adapt and move differently as circumstances change on the ground. That he believes, are the direction of American foreign policy is going. If it's not going well for Americans and for the world, then he'd be willing to shift.
Right. And as you write, I mean, we're operating within a very kind of narrow permission structure here as it relates to people who are diplomats or who have ambitions in terms of like
Right.
diplomacy or the Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. I'm not sure. I think I mentioned this, but Gordon is expected to probably stay on if Harris were to win as not the VP National Security Advisor, but the actual National Security Advisor. So you mentioned that he expressed regret about arming the opposition in Syria. What were the overall takeaways from his book about how he views foreign policy? You write that he shouldn't be described as a progressive, but as a pragmatic internationalist.
Mm-hmm.
Could you define that for the audience?
Sure. So what I think Gordon believes in is that American power is or can be a force for good. As I said earlier, that American military power isn't necessarily bad in and of itself, but that should be used judiciously. And it should always be used with a sense of what the consequences might be, the unintended consequences might be. So the book essentially is not a history of the Middle East. It's not a history of U.S. Middle East relations. It's a history of regime change in the Middle East. And Gordon goes through a series of case studies beginning in Iran in 1953, ending with Syria in the 2013-2018 period, and essentially says every time the United States has either overthrown a dictator or tried to overthrow a dictator, it's been bad for American interests and bad for the region. And that reflects, I think, sort of that pragmatic part of that internationalist definition, that he thinks that American power, if it should be used, it has to be used in ways that correlate means and ends, that the United States can't be getting ahead of itself, it can't be getting stretched too thin, that it should maybe use military force as a last resort. There are other options, sanctions, diplomacy, aid, foreign aid that can be used. And if that keeps a bad regime in place, but that is also stabilizing a region or stabilizing a country, that's a better alternative for the United States than trying to overthrow a country or trying to overthrow a leader of a country, and perhaps try to instill democracy in that country. That's not good. So he has an internationalist worldview. He has a view of American power. He believes American power can be good, but it ultimately can be disastrous if it's not used well.
And you also write that he had criticisms of the Iraq War early on, really more about like, oh, we could be fighting the war on terror in a way that makes more sense, that's smarter. Again, for the audience, this is not where our politics or my politics are, right? But this, in this spectrum, he was critical of the Iraq War at its outset. What do his writings say about the Iraq War in particular?
Yeah, so he believed that going into Iraq unilaterally to overthrow Saddam was a bad idea. That if you were to overthrow Saddam, you'd have to get an international coalition behind the United States. The United States doesn't have that. France, Germany do not support the invasion. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, does support the invasion, but that's not enough for Gordon. It's not enough. That's not a majority of NATO states. There's not a huge European backing behind traditional allies in Europe behind the war, and therefore he believes that this is going to end badly. You're going to have to then pour, which happens, a large amount of American resources into rebuilding the country, which is what happens, and we also don't know what kind of security vacuum will exist when Saddam is gone. And that's basically what he says in a roundabout way. By 2004, he's saying that this was not a good idea. The way that the Bush administration did it, it doesn't look like it's going to end well. And by 2006, he's saying, we should effectively kill the Bush, vision of preemptive war. And he's glad that the Bush idea of preemptive war, going into countries, overthrowing leaders with the hopes that democracy will spring forth or that it will deter other would-be aggressors from invading other countries and, potentially even spreading nuclear weapons around to terrorists. That idea is actually not effective, and we should shift back to a more, internationalist mindset, multilateral approach to conducting foreign policy. And so his critique of the Iraq War isn't one from the left. It's not a one that you or I would make, but it's still quite powerful given the times in which most of the Democratic establishment, certainly in Congress, were saying, well, we don't quite want to back the war, but we should back the war kind of thing, and capitulating to Bush's war plans. And here Gordon was kind of qualifying his language a little bit, but essentially saying that the war wasn't going to end well, if Bush pursues in the ways that he did. And sure enough, he was right.
China policy, is it your assessment that he would kind of pursue the same, hawkishness that the Biden administration has adopted?
That's one area I think you will see some continuity, unfortunately. Right. I think great power competition with China has become overwhelming in Washington. It's not quite clear. Again, I think there are reports of Sullivan conducting back channel diplomacy, of Blinken, meeting with his Chinese counterparts. Those are encouraging signs, but if you hear the rhetoric, certainly from the GOP, who are China hawks all the way up and down the line, that kind of China's out to get us, China's out to quote unquote eat our lunch, end quote, from Biden, that kind of the rhetoric is not going to go away, because all the incentives in Washington, political, foreign policy wise, economic even, the idea that great power competition can provide a boon to economic security in the United States through jobs and things like that, that's all going to be there. And I don't think at the moment there's an incentive to shift. I think you would see, in Gordon's view, you'd see a shift if there were to be escalation to the point of potential war with Taiwan. Americans, if you look at the polls, aren't willing to fight a war in Taiwan over semiconductors, and I think that is unfortunately where we're at. A lot of people are in Washington are preparing for a war in Taiwan, and I think if it got to that point, I think you'd see Gordon starting to pull back, if indeed there were a Harris administration. But right now, I don't see any daylight on the China side of things.
And really, of course, this is, I left the most important piece, honestly, for last, the Israel-Palestine. He put out that statement saying that Harris does not support an arms embargo. We talked about how he's still technically a part of the Biden administration, even though he is her national security advisor. Some of the language was very specific about Israel's right to defend itself from Iran. What was your read on that statement? And I guess you could expand that into his history with Israel. And if you think that there is a shift here, a difference in ideology with Biden and his team.
Yeah, I do think, to pivot a little bit to Harris now, privately, she has made some criticisms of the Biden policy. That since the late winter of 2023, she's made criticisms and saying we need to talk about Palestinian suffering more. And I think that's partly a reflection of Gordon too. And Gordon has said, if you look at throughout his writings, what I found was that consistent support for the two-state solution, right? And I think he still believes that. It's more elusive now, a two-state solution, right? And that's.
I mean, every Democrat says that, right?
Every Democrat says that, right? Exactly.
And it's not. It's like it's a fiction, in my view.
At this point, it's getting harder and harder to see how that can actually happen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a continuity. I think what you would see is the separation from, if we're looking at Gordon's book as a guide to what policy should be or would be in a Harris administration, Gordon abhors escalation, particularly unnecessary escalation. And the war has escalated to a point where it's no longer, no longer where Americans thought it was going to be in the winter of 2023. And I think now there's a situation where the United States is preparing for a regional war, preparing for Iran to get involved, and that's contrary to our larger interests as Americans, I would say, but certainly to Gordon's view on world order or world affairs and foreign policy. And so if there were to be, I think, a Harris administration and Gordon's a part of it as a national security advisor, I think you would see immediately kind of like, how do we pull back from this escalatory, ladder that's happening, and what can we do? But that is hard given, as you said, the statements made by Harris on the arms embargo, on the statements like about conditioning material assistance to Israel. I think there are signs that she'd be willing to do that, but you'd have to have a departure from the current course of action. And I think, again, unfortunately, things would have to get worse before they would get better on that front. And
how is it possible to get worse?
Wider war with Iran involved and Hezbollah involved, and a greater situation where the United States is now looking at, again, and Gordon's fears, like a regime change situation, right? Where, like, what do we do now? Where we've got a series of American enemies in the Middle East ganging up on Israel. Like, what do we do? And I think that's not good for American policymakers to be confronting that soon. I think it's potentially or hopefully unlikely, but at the same time, I think that would be a scary scenario where you would start to see a pullback or shift in policy.
Well, Israel just overnight escalated in the West Bank, and
Right.
it was the basically the heaviest attacks in 2 decades nearly.
Right.
I mean, Hezbollah, they're going to respond. I mean, this is also trying to get Hezbollah to respond, in my view, to draw the United States into this war.
Potentially, yeah. And I think this is what's happening now. I mean, I would say this is why the unwillingness of the Biden administration to shift and to say, oh, we made a mistake, we should own up to this and do something to stop this, I think is bad. Just to watch it happen and say we support Israel, unconditionally. It's one thing to say we support the Israeli state and we support, the existence of Israel. Yes, that's obviously. Find viable to support the existence of Israel, but to support the Israeli war policy, that's completely different, and that's not happening. There should be some separation between the two, and I think that's what you saw in the Harris speech, was that trying to say I support the existence of Israel, I support the Israeli state, but yet that kind of not transitioning into a distinction from the Israeli war policy, I think is a problem for American foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, and as it relates to Harris herself and her role as vice president, what is your view on the balancing act that it appears that she's doing in terms of Biden's foreign policy, not trying to have it tied to her, but also not trying to undermine the sitting president for better, for worse? I mean, it's for worse in my view, but for better, for worse, while she's still a part of the administration. This is quite a unique set of circumstances.
Yeah, I think there have been comparisons made to 1968 and Hubert Humphrey as Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Humphrey came out against the war in 65, said this is not, before February 1965, saying this is bad, don't do this, Mr. President. Johnson did it anyways, and he thoroughly backed it. There have been comparisons in 68 saying, well, will Harris do what Humphrey did, and eventually by September of 68 came out for a resolution to the war. Which was a clear break from Lyndon Johnson's support for ongoing war. I think if that would happen, you'd have to see the situation be one where Gaza becomes a larger problem for her in the polls. It's already breaking up in elements of the Democratic coalition, but not to the extent that the Democratic coalition is completely fractured, where she can't win the Electoral College in November. And I think there would also have to be some willingness on the Harris administration to say this policy to carve out early, to say this policy will not be my policy going forward. But that again would depend upon the politics of it. And right now, she's not in a position where she feels she has to. I would say, come out against Biden's policy for her political survival at this point. That's those are the conditions right now. And I think that's right. She's going to have to toe the line. And you look at the DNC platform. It's very much Biden's platform.
Copy paste. Yep.
Yeah, and that partly has to do with when she announced, but it also has to do with, I think, her trying to continue in many ways the Biden legacy and needing him and needing his backing, I think, in many ways for the election.
I guess, I'm trying to balance my seeing things like about Philip Gordon and the optimism there with those practical realities, and it's difficult. I'm parsing you're parsing all this information. You're hoping in one direction, but I am based on your writing. Gordon just seems like an improvement on this West exec crew with Tony Blinken and Biden's deep ideology. I guess to kind of wrap up here, if you could give your overarching assessment of the Biden administration's foreign policy, and do you think that the Obama crew, like the Iran deal guys, Ben Rhodes, Philip Gordon, who were willing to say, hey, screw you to Israel with the Iran deal. Like, people forget that Israel and the Israel lobby was heavily against the Iran deal. And that's part of why I thought it was such a good achievement of the Obama administration. And Biden not pursuing that, Biden pursuing an even more entrenched policy with Israel. I mean, in 2013, at least the Obama administration attempted those peace talks with Israel and Palestinians. It didn't go anywhere, but Biden didn't even gesture towards that. In the first 3 years of his administration, I think you could say, like, part of that probably increased the desperation for Hamas at the pursuance of the Abraham Accords across two administrations, or not. And they've mentioned that as a part of the reason why they attacked on October 7th. Like, do those Obama people undercarry the Iran deal folks? Is there significant daylight between them and Biden and Tony Blinken and the West exec people?
I think, to sum up sort of Biden's foreign policy, I think, that the situation in 2021 was one that, we're going to pull out from Afghanistan, we're going to get out of forever wars, wind up the war on terror, move to China competition. And a lot of the people you mentioned were very much interested in, seeing China as the next threat, and they viewed China as the next threat, the only threat that can match American power, both in economic and military terms. And then Ukraine happens in 2022, and then October 7th happens, and I think the China policy doesn't go away, and so now you've got essentially the United States trying to be the arsenal of democracy to Ukraine, trying to constrain China, trying to support Israel in its fight against terrorists and Hamas, and at the same time proclaim the end of neoliberal policy and try to create a new industrial policy. And if you look at Biden's foreign policy, it started out from in 2021, 2022 for, I would say, optimism for progressives in the left, right? Completely in terms of outside of
drastically
China
reduced drone strikes, for example.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. A departure away from Obama. And now what's happening is that we've actually gotten more deeper in the Middle East. There is stalemate in Ukraine, or that doesn't have an end game at the moment, where both sides are, making some ground, depending upon the day, depending upon the week. And China tensions have escalated. And I think so the track record is such where good intentions, spiraled out of control, because I think American primacy is hard to maintain in 2024. That was sort of where I ended the Gordon piece, was that if you look at Gordon's policy, it all sounds good in terms of the Middle East. Don't try to overthrow countries or regimes. Don't try to overthrow dictators. It will always lead to bad consequences. Try to figure out what's practical and what's limited. But yet, the United States is committed to primacy and trying to save the world from threats, autocracy versus democracy in Biden's terms, then that's invariably a policy that's going to get you involved in ways that are stretched, that you're stretched too thin. And I think that's the legacy of the Biden administration, is that from starting out from very, limited means, limited, goals to sort of to let things grow and expand to the point where we're facing now multiple threats, multiple issues across the world, and we need someone to think about how to prioritize them. Because, again, the United States, to paraphrase against Stephen wartime, the United States can't have it all, and we have to think very clearly about what foreign policy would be over the next 4 years, and it's drastically better under Harris. I would say if she starts to adopt some things that Gordon advocates for and commits to the end of primacy.
Well, that second part, it seems like, I don't know if Gordon's there yet, but
he's not. No.
But yeah, I mean, I was happy to read your piece, some optimistic signs about him and their closeness as well. It just has to translate, obviously.
Right.
And we don't, I mean, and Palestinians are dying every single day, so we don't have much time, but really appreciate you coming on today, Michael Brenes. The piece is called "The Harris Doctrine" in the Boston Review. We will link to that below. And Michael, you have some books, right, that you can plug if you'd like?
Yes. I have a new book coming out in January called "The Rivalry Peril: How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy." That's co-authored with Van Jackson. I think has also been a guest on your show. Yeah. I also have Substack, Warfare and Welfare, which you can subscribe to. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Of course. And we should have you back on in January for your book.
Love to.
Okay.
Love to.
Great. Awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.